May 26, 1941. Lake Pontchartrain, New Orleans, Louisiana. Commander Ross Daggett from the Navy Bureau of Ships stood at the water's edge, his arms crossed tightly across his chest as he watched a peculiar plywood boat slam repeatedly into the concrete seawall. The hull shuddered with each impact, then reversed, spun almost within its own length, and charged the wall again. Behind him, Major Ernest Linsert of the Marine Corps Equipment Board scribbled notes with increasing urgency. They had come to witness what the Navy brass in Washington had dismissed as the fantasy of a brawling Irishman with more mouth than sense. What they were about to see would change the course of the Second World War. The man orchestrating this violent ballet was Andrew Jackson Higgins, and he was demonstrating a boat with a feature so radical that Navy engineers had spent 20 years failing to achieve it. A simple steel ramp on the bow that could drop down and allow men and vehicles to charge directly onto a beach. In 4 years, this plywood ramp would land more Allied soldiers on hostile shores than all other methods combined. Without it, Dwight Eisenhower would later reflect in 1964, the Allied strategy for winning the war would have been impossible. The origins of this moment began not in triumph, but in failure. In 1931, the lumber export company owned by Andrew Jackson Higgins entered voluntary receivership during the Great Depression. The businessman from Nebraska had built a fleet of sailing ships to transport hardwood from the Philippines and Central America, constructing his own shipyard to service them. When global trade evaporated, both A.J. Higgins Lumber and Export Company and Higgins Industries were placed into voluntary receivership, with a friendly judge appointing Higgins as his own receiver. Higgins found himself with a boatyard, mounting debts, and a stubborn refusal to quit. He had learned boat design during a brief stint in the Nebraska National Guard and perfected it through necessity in the Louisiana bayous. The shallow marshes and debris-choked waterways of the Gulf Coast demanded boats that could navigate in 18 inches of water, plow through vegetation, run over submerged logs, and beach themselves on muddy banks without fouling their propellers. Conventional boat designs failed miserably in these conditions. Higgins designed something different. His Eureka boat, developed in 1926 and refined throughout the 1930s, featured innovations that seemed simple, but were devastatingly effective. The bow was shaped like a spoon, allowing it to ride up onto obstacles rather than ploughing into them. A solid pine block called the headlog reinforced the bow, making it the strongest part of the boat capable of absorbing tremendous impacts. The hull design was revolutionary. A deep V shape at the front transitioned to a reverse curve amidships, then flattened into planning surfaces at the rear. This created aerated water flow that reduced friction and increased speed. Most crucially, Higgins built a semi-tunnel into the hull that protected the propeller and drive shaft. The boat could run full speed into a beach, the propeller safely recessed, then reverse off without damage. Oil drillers bought them for accessing remote drilling sites. Trappers used them in the marshes. Bootleggers, during Prohibition's final years, appreciated their speed and shallow draft for rum-running operations. The boats performed reliably, and Higgins kept his small operation alive through the Depression by building them one at a time. Through ingenuity and determination, Higgins created Boat Services Company in 1931, a third business that purchased craft from Higgins Industries and leased or sold them to others. This arrangement allowed him to keep nearly 50 people employed. By 1935, he had paid off his debts and maintained solvency while other businesses collapsed around him. In 1937, halfway around the world, events were unfolding that would eventually bring the US military to Higgins's door. Japanese forces were invading China, and American military observers were watching closely. Lieutenant Victor Krulak of the US Marine Corps stood on a Shanghai rooftop in the summer of 1937 with a camera equipped with a telephoto lens. Below him, Japanese troops were conducting amphibious landings during the Battle of Shanghai, using boats unlike anything in the American arsenal. These Japanese Daihatsu-class landing craft had a simple but brilliant feature: a bow ramp that dropped down, allowing troops and equipment to charge directly onto the beach rather than climbing over the sides while under fire. Krulak took photographs and sent them back to Washington with a detailed report titled "Japanese Assault Boats, Shanghai, 1937. His superiors filed it away with a notation dismissing it as the work of some nut out in China. The US military in the late 1930s was ill-prepared for amphibious warfare, despite the Marine Corps' growing conviction that such operations would be essential in any coming war. The Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair had been tasked with developing landing craft, but had produced designs that were, in Higgins' later assessment, worthless. When the Navy held competitive trials for landing craft designs in 1938, Higgins was not invited. He learned about the tests only after every submitted design had failed. The Marine Corps, frustrated with the Navy's inability to produce a workable landing craft, remembered the strange boats they had heard about from the Coast Guard, who had purchased several Eureka boats for rescue operations. They contacted Higgins directly, bypassing the Navy's procurement system. In 1938, Higgins brought his Eureka boat to Norfolk, Virginia, for Navy and Marine Corps testing. The trials were a revelation. The Higgins boat outperformed every Navy design, running up onto beaches at full speed, reversing off cleanly, turning in impossibly tight circles, and maintaining speed in shallow water where Navy boats wallowed. During fleet landing exercises in February 1939, Marine officers watched with growing excitement as the Eureka boats performed flawlessly in conditions that would have destroyed conventional craft. The boat's shallow draft allowed it to operate in waters where other vessels grounded helplessly. The protected propeller meant it could beach and reverse without fouling. The spoon-shaped bow absorbed impacts that would have stove in traditional hulls. The Navy brass in Washington remained deeply skeptical. The Bureau of Ships had invested years in their own designs and viewed this civilian boat builder from the swamps as an upstart intruding on their territory. The Navy represented the clubby world of Eastern shipbuilding giants with established contracts and political connections. Higgins, with his profanity-laced vocabulary and aggressive personality, was decidedly not part of that club. In a moment that would become legendary, Higgins traveled to Washington and visited the Bureau of Ships. When shown the Navy's landing craft blueprints, he took a pencil and scrawled across them, "This boat stinks, AJH." The Navy officers were not amused by this brash civilian's assessment of years of their engineering work. But after their designs continued to fail in tests while Higgins's boats succeeded, they had no choice. In 1939, the Navy reluctantly ordered Higgins to build landing craft based on his Eureka design. These were designated Landing Craft, Personnel, or LCP. They could carry troops to shore effectively, but they had one critical flaw that Marine officers recognized immediately. Soldiers had to climb over the sides to disembark, exposing them to enemy fire and making unloading slow and dangerous. Men laden with 60 pounds of equipment struggled to clamber over the gunnels while under fire. In training exercises, the process was cumbersome. In combat, it would be lethal. The Marines knew this was unacceptable, but had no immediate solution to the problem. By April 1941, Victor Krulak had built a balsa wood model of the Japanese landing craft based on his 1937 Shanghai photographs. During a meeting at the Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia, Krulak showed Higgins the model and explained the Japanese design featuring a retractable bow ramp. Higgins examined it for perhaps 30 seconds, his experienced eye immediately grasping the implications. He called his chief engineer on the spot. Within hours, design work had begun. Higgins was not a man who moved slowly when he saw a solution to a problem. At his own expense, without waiting for Navy approval or contracts, he built 3 prototype boats, modifying his proven Eureka design to incorporate a bow ramp. The ramp was steel, reinforced, and could be lowered quickly by a simple mechanical system. When raised, it formed the protective bow of the boat. When lowered, it became a ramp wide enough for men to charge down 4 or 5 abreast, or for a jeep to drive directly onto the beach. The prototypes were ready for testing by late May 1941. Krulak would go on to a distinguished career, rising to Lieutenant General and becoming one of the most influential strategists in Marine Corps history. He advocated for helicopter assault tactics that would define amphibious operations in the jet age, and wrote First to Fight, an inside view of the US Marine Corps, a classic text on Marine Corps history. He maintained throughout his life that the Higgins boat was the most important tactical innovation of World War II, and he died in 2008 at the age of 95, having witnessed the boats he helped inspire participate in operations from Guadalcanal to the invasions of Iraq. On that pivotal day, May 26, 1941, Commander Daggett and Major Linsert arrived at Lake Pontchartrain to witness demonstrations that would validate or dismiss months of Higgins' work. Higgins demonstrated his boats with characteristic flair and showmanship. He loaded 36 of his employees into one of the boats, simulating a fully loaded combat platoon. The boat roared across the lake at 12 knots, ran directly up onto the shore with the bow lifting slightly, dropped its ramp with a metallic clang, and disgorged all 36 men in seconds. The men charged down the ramp and onto the beach as the boat's engine idled. Then the ramp raised, the boat reversed off the beach smoothly, spun in a tight circle, and repeated the demonstration. Higgins then drove a truck onto the boat, demonstrating the craft's vehicle carrying capacity. The boat approached the shore again, beached, dropped its ramp, and Higgins drove the truck directly onto shore down the ramp without hesitation. The military observers were stunned. This was exactly what the Marine Corps needed for amphibious assault operations. The Navy Bureau of Ships, however, remained hostile to this outsider who had shown them up repeatedly. They had spent 2 decades trying to develop a tank landing craft and had failed utterly. When Higgins designed and built an effective tank landing craft in 61 hours as a demonstration of what was possible, the Bureau despised him for exposing their inefficiency. But the Marine Corps was insistent. They needed these boats, and they needed them in large numbers immediately. As war with Japan became increasingly likely in late 1941, the Navy finally placed substantial orders for what would become the Landing Craft, Vehicle, Personnel, or LCVP. The Higgins boat, as it would be universally known by the troops who rode in it, was officially born. The designation would later prove confusing to historians. LCVP referred specifically to the ramped version, distinct from the earlier LCP variants without ramps. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Higgins Industries employed fewer than 75 workers in a single boatyard. The company's net sales in 1937 had been $422,000. Andrew Higgins immediately understood what the attack meant for his business and for America. He began expanding before receiving additional orders, opening new facilities and hiring workers at a pace that stunned observers and violated every conventional business practice. He acquired land near City Park, along the Industrial Canal, and at Michoud in eastern New Orleans. He set up production lines using assembly techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing, revolutionary for boat building. Traditional boat construction was a craft, with skilled workers building boats one at a time. Higgins transformed it into mass production, with workers specializing in specific tasks along an assembly line. He hired anyone who could work: white men, black men, women, elderly workers, disabled workers. This was unprecedented in New Orleans and throughout the South. Higgins Industries became the first fully integrated workforce in the city, shattering racial barriers that had existed for generations. All workers were paid equal wages according to their job rating, regardless of race or gender. Black workers and white workers labored side by side on the same assembly lines, earning the same pay for the same work. Women operated machinery traditionally reserved for men. When criticized by other Southern businessmen who maintained strict segregation, Higgins was characteristically blunt. He attended the Southern Conference for Human Welfare in Nashville in April 1941 and made a speech about the rights of African Americans that shocked the business establishment. Eleanor Roosevelt, who attended the conference, called him one of the most enlightened businessmen in America. Higgins' response to critics was direct. He needed workers, and he did not care about their color or gender. He cared whether they could build boats to the exacting standards required to save American lives. The workers responded to his leadership with fierce loyalty and unprecedented production. Higgins installed loudspeaker systems throughout his plants so he could address all workers simultaneously from his office. When special rush jobs came in, he appeared on the factory floor personally, exhorting workers to greater effort with profanity-laced pep talks that somehow inspired rather than offended. Signs hung throughout the facilities with slogans designed to motivate. The guy who relaxes is helping the Axis. Workers understood that every boat they built would carry American soldiers into combat. A single defect could mean dozens of deaths. The pressure was immense, but workers took pride in their craftsmanship. They called him Andy, and they meant it with a mixture of affection and respect. When he gave them a 12.5% pay raise in August 1942, he suggested strongly that the increase go into war bonds. The workers complied, subscribing to bonds at 15% of payroll without complaint. By late 1943, Higgins Industries operated 7 manufacturing plants in New Orleans. The workforce had exploded from fewer than 75 in 1938 to more than 25,000 workers by late 1943, though some sources cite 20,000 as the peak figure depending on counting methods across multiple facilities.